Good day, friends, and welcome back to Conflicts of the Human Race. Today, I will tell you about the entire story of the Second Crusade, 1147, 1149. Now buckle up as we begin. The year was 1144, and devastating news reached the courts of Europe. Edessa, the first Crusader state established during the triumphant First Crusade, had fallen to the brilliant Muslim general Imad ad-Din Zengi. This catastrophic loss sent shockwaves throughout Christendom, threatening the very foundation of Christian presence in the Holy Land. The fall of Edessa represented more than just a military defeat. It symbolized the fragility of the Crusader kingdoms and exposed their vulnerability to resurgent Muslim forces. European nobles, who had grown complacent after decades of relative stability in the East, suddenly faced the reality that their holy conquests were under serious threat. The loss demanded immediate action, setting the stage for what would become the Second Crusade. Pope Eugenius III, deeply troubled by the loss of Edessa, recognized that only a massive, coordinated effort could restore Christian dominance in the Holy Land. In December 1145, he issued the papal bull Quantum Predecessors, formally calling for a new crusade. However, the initial response from European nobility was disappointingly lukewarm. Many nobles remembered the enormous costs and casualties of previous expeditions, while others were preoccupied with local conflicts and political struggles. The Pope realized that his call needed a more persuasive voice, someone with the moral authority and rhetorical power to ignite the religious fervor necessary for such an undertaking. He turned to Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential religious figure of his time, renowned for his passionate preaching and unwavering devotion to the Church. Bernard, despite his initial reluctance and preference for monastic contemplation, eventually agreed to champion the cause. His decision would prove instrumental in transforming what seemed like a failing enterprise into one of the largest military expeditions of the medieval period. On March 31, 1146, at Vézelay in Burgundy, Bernard of Clairvaux delivered what many historians consider one of the most powerful and influential sermons in medieval history. Before a massive crowd that included King Louis VII of France, Queen Elena of Aquitaine, and countless nobles, Bernard's passionate words ignited a religious fervor that swept through the assembly like wildfire. His eloquent description of Christian duty and the promise of spiritual rewards for those who took up the cross proved irresistible. The response was so overwhelming that the organizers quickly ran out of cloth crosses to distribute to the eager volunteers. Bernard, in a dramatic gesture that became legendary, tore his own robes into strips to create makeshift crosses for the multitude of volunteers. King Louis VII himself was among the first to take the cross, lending royal authority to the cause. The sermon at Vézelay transformed the struggling recruitment effort into a mass movement that would soon spread throughout France and beyond, marking the true beginning of the Second Crusade. Emboldened by the remarkable success at Vézelay, Bernard of Clairvaux embarked on an extensive preaching tour throughout the German lands, determined to secure the participation of Conrad III, the Holy Roman Emperor. The prospect of both French and German royal participation would lend unprecedented prestige and military strength to the crusading effort. Bernard's reputation as a miracle worker and his persuasive abilities preceded him as he traveled from city to city, drawing enormous crowds wherever he appeared. His sermons, delivered in Latin but translated for local populations, emphasized the spiritual rewards awaiting crusaders and the urgent need to defend Christianity in the East. The climax of his German campaign came during the Christmas court at Speyer in 1146, where Conrad III initially resisted taking the cross, citing the complex political situation within the empire and his ongoing conflicts with various nobles. However, Bernard's persistent appeals and the growing enthusiasm among German nobles eventually wore down the emperor's resistance. By early 1147, Conrad III had committed himself and the might of the Holy Roman Empire to the crusading cause, ensuring that the Second Crusade would be the largest military expedition since the First Crusade. While the main crusading armies prepared for their eastern expedition, a parallel and tragic campaign unfolded along the Rhine Valley and in other parts of Europe. Despite explicit papal prohibitions and Bernard's condemnation, local preachers like the Cistercian monk Radolf began promoting attacks on Jewish communities as a preliminary step to fighting Muslims in the Holy Land. These unauthorized campaigns quickly spiraled into widespread persecution and massacre of Jewish populations in Würzburg, Mainz, Cologne, and numerous other cities. The violence was particularly brutal in the Rhineland, where entire Jewish communities were destroyed by mobs claiming to act in the name of the Crusade. Bernard of Clairvaux, horrified by these developments, personally traveled to the affected regions to condemn the violence and attempt to restore order. His intervention saved many lives, but the damage had already been done. These pogroms created lasting trauma in Jewish communities and stained the reputation of the crusading movement. The incidents also revealed the difficulty of controlling popular religious enthusiasm once it had been unleashed, foreshadowing some of the challenges that would plague the main crusading expedition itself. By the spring of 1147, two massive armies had assembled, each representing the military might of their respective kingdoms. The French contingent, led by King Louis VII, gathered at Metz and included not only the king and his formidable Queen Elena of Aquitaine, but also numerous powerful nobles from across France. The army was impressively equipped and well supplied, reflecting France's growing prosperity and administrative efficiency. Meanwhile, Conrad III's German force assembled separately, comprising knights and soldiers from across the Holy Roman Empire. The German army was arguably even larger than the French contingent, including seasoned warriors from Bavaria, Swabia, and other imperial territories. Both armies chose to travel overland through Constantinople rather than risk the dangerous Mediterranean sea route, following roughly the same path as the First Crusade 50 years earlier. The decision to take separate routes was partly due to logistical concerns about feeding such massive forces, but also reflected the underlying rivalry between the two monarchs. As both armies began their march eastward, European chroniclers proclaimed it the largest military expedition in Christian history, with combined forces estimated at over 100,000 men. Conrad III's German army was the first to depart, beginning their march through Hungary in late spring 1147. The initial stages of the journey proceeded smoothly, with Hungarian King Géza II providing markets and safe passage as agreed upon in advanced negotiations. The German forces maintained good discipline during this early phase, paying for supplies and avoiding the conflicts that had marred earlier crusading expeditions. However, as the massive army approached the Byzantine frontier, tensions began to emerge. The sheer size of the force strained local resources and created logistical challenges that had not been fully anticipated. Reports reached Conrad of Byzantine military preparations and diplomatic correspondence with Muslim rulers, fueling suspicions about Emperor Manuel I Komnenos' true intentions. These concerns were further heightened by reports from advance scouts about the concentration of Byzantine troops near Constantinople. Despite these growing anxieties, Conrad pressed forward, determined to maintain the expedition's momentum. The German army's passage through the Balkans proceeded without major incident, but the underlying tensions between Western Crusaders and the Byzantine Empire, which had plagued relations since the First Crusade, were clearly beginning to resurface. When Conrad's German army reached Constantinople in September 1147, the meeting between the Holy Roman Emperor and Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos was marked by elaborate ceremony, but underlying mutual suspicion. Manuel, facing the arrival of over 70,000 foreign soldiers at his capital's gates, was understandably nervous about the potential threat to his empire. The Byzantines remembered well the violence and chaos that had accompanied the passage of the First Crusade, and Manuel was determined to move the German army across the Bosphorus as quickly as possible. Lavish entertainments and diplomatic gifts masked the tension as both emperors maneuvered for advantage. Conrad grew increasingly suspicious of Manuel's true loyalties, particularly after receiving reports that the Byzantine emperor had been in diplomatic contact with the Sultan of Iconium. These suspicions were not entirely unfounded. Manuel was indeed pursuing a complex diplomatic strategy that involved maintaining relationships with both Christian and Muslim powers. After several days of tense negotiations, an agreement was reached for the German army's passage into Asia Minor. However, the lack of accurate information about conditions ahead and the failure to coordinate properly with Byzantine forces would soon prove catastrophic for Conrad's expedition. In October 1147, disaster struck Conrad's German army in the mountains of Anatolia near Dorylaeum, the same location where the First Crusade had achieved a famous victory 50 years earlier. The German forces, inadequately supplied and poorly informed about enemy positions, found themselves ambushed by the Seljuk Turks of Sultan Masud. The Turkish forces, employing their traditional tactics of mounted archery and swift retreat, devastated the slower-moving Crusader army. The German knights, weighed down by heavy armor and exhausted by the difficult mountain terrain, proved unable to respond effectively to the Turkish hit-and-run attacks. What began as harassment quickly escalated into a full-scale rout as panic spread through the German ranks. Conrad himself was wounded in the fighting, and thousands of his men were killed or captured. The survivors, demoralized and lacking adequate supplies, were forced to retreat back toward Byzantine territory. This catastrophic defeat effectively eliminated the German army as an effective fighting force and dealt a devastating blow to the entire crusading enterprise. The disaster at Dorylaeum demonstrated the continued effectiveness of Turkish military tactics against Western heavy cavalry in the challenging terrain of Asia Minor. Meanwhile, Louis VII's French army had been making steady progress through the Balkans, unaware of the catastrophe that had befallen their German allies. The French forces had maintained better discipline and organization during their march, benefiting from a leaner of Aquitaine's administrative skills and the lessons learned from previous expeditions. When Louis reached Constantinople in early October 1147, just as news of Conrad's defeat was reaching the Byzantine capital, he found a very different reception than his German counterpart had received. Manuel I Comnenos, now dealing with the aftermath of one crusading disaster and facing the arrival of another massive Western army, was even more anxious to expedite the French passage into Asia Minor. The French king, initially confident about his expedition's prospects, began to grasp the magnitude of the challenges facing the crusade when he met with the wounded Conrad III, who had managed to return to Constantinople with the remnants of his army. The two monarchs, setting aside their previous rivalries in the face of shared adversity, began planning a joint strategy for the remainder of the campaign. However, the psychological impact of the German defeat had already begun to undermine morale among the French troops. In November 1147, the combined French and surviving German forces crossed the Bosphorus into Asia Minor, hoping that their united strength would prove more effective than Conrad's isolated expedition had been. The decision was made to follow the coastal route through western Anatolia, which promised better access to supplies and potential naval support from Italian maritime republics. Initially, this strategy seemed sound, as the combined army made good progress along the Aegean coast, successfully capturing several minor fortifications and maintaining relatively high morale. Louis VII and Conrad III, despite their political differences, managed to coordinate their forces effectively during this phase of the campaign. The French contingent, still largely intact and well-equipped, provided the bulk of the fighting strength, while Conrad's remaining German veterans contributed valuable experience about Turkish tactics and the challenges of campaigning in Anatolia. However, as the army moved further from the coast and into the interior regions, the familiar problems of supply shortages, disease, and constant harassment by Turkish forces began to take their toll. The winter weather added another layer of difficulty, making movements slower and more treacherous as the crusading army struggled through increasingly hostile territory. As the crusading army pushed deeper into Anatolia during the winter months of 1147–1148, they encountered increasingly fierce resistance from Turkish forces operating under the overall command of Sultan Masud of Iconium. The Turks had learned valuable lessons from their victory over Conrad's isolated force, and now employed a strategy of constant harassment designed to wear down the Crusaders through attrition rather than decisive battle. Turkish mounted archers would appear suddenly to attack supply trains and stragglers, then vanish before the heavily armored Western knights could respond effectively. The mountainous terrain of Anatolia favored the defenders, who knew every pass and valley, while the Crusaders struggled with unfamiliar geography and unreliable local guides. Supply problems became critical as the army moved further from the coast and found local populations hostile or fled. Disease began to spread through the ranks, weakened by poor nutrition and the stress of constant vigilance against enemy attacks. Despite these mounting difficulties, Louis VII maintained discipline within his forces and continued to press forward, believing that reaching the Holy Land remained achievable. However, the cumulative effect of these challenges was steadily eroding the combat effectiveness and morale of what had begun as one of the most impressive military expeditions in European history. In January 1148, the crusading army faced its most severe crisis when attempting to cross the treacherous mountain passes leading toward the Cilician coast. The route, chosen to avoid major Turkish strongholds, proved to be a trap as enemy forces occupied the high ground and launched devastating attacks on the strung-out columns of Crusaders struggling through narrow defiles. The Battle of Mount Cadmus became a disaster comparable to Conrad's earlier defeat, as Turkish archers systematically decimated the French rearguard, while the main body of the army was unable to provide effective support due to the difficult terrain. Louis VII himself narrowly escaped death when his position was overrun, reportedly saved only by climbing a tree and remaining hidden until Turkish forces withdrew. Elena of Aquitaine, traveling with the army despite the dangers, witnessed firsthand the collapse of what had seemed like an invincible force just months earlier. Hundreds of knights and thousands of foot soldiers were killed or captured during this catastrophic engagement. The survivors, now reduced to perhaps a quarter of their original strength, were forced to abandon most of their heavy equipment and supplies. The dream of a triumphant restoration of Christian power in the East was rapidly becoming a nightmare of survival. The remnants of the crusading army, now drastically reduced in numbers and combat effectiveness, finally reached the relative safety of Attalia, modern Antalya, on the Mediterranean coast in February 1148. The port city, controlled by the Byzantine Empire, offered the possibility of evacuation by sea, but the available shipping was insufficient to transport all the surviving Crusaders. Faced with this logistical crisis, Louis VII made the controversial decision to embark with his nobles and remaining knights, leaving behind thousands of foot soldiers and non-combatants to continue overland through hostile territory. This decision, while militarily logical given the limited resources, created lasting resentment among those abandoned and damaged Louis's reputation for chivalric honor. Many of those left behind at Attalia would never reach the Holy Land, falling victim to disease, starvation, or Turkish attacks during their desperate attempt to continue the journey on foot. Conrad III, still recovering from his wounds and facing the complete collapse of his German contingent, also arranged for sea transport to Acre. The evacuation from Attalia marked the effective end of the Second Crusade as a coordinated military campaign, transforming what had begun as a mighty expedition into a desperate rescue operation for the surviving leadership. In March 1148, Louis VII and the surviving French nobles finally reached Antioch, one of the major Crusader states, where they were received by Prince Raymond of Poitiers. Raymond, Elena of Aquitaine's uncle, and an experienced military commander familiar with Middle Eastern warfare, proposed a strategic campaign to recapture Edessa and restore the northern frontier of the Crusader territories. His plan was militarily sound and would have addressed the original objective of the Second Crusade. However, Louis VII, influenced by his religious advisors and perhaps seeking to restore his reputation through a more prestigious target, insisted on proceeding directly to Jerusalem to fulfill his pilgrim vows. This decision created a serious rift between the royal couple, as Elena supported her uncle's strategic assessment and may have preferred to remain in the sophisticated court of Antioch. The disagreement revealed deeper problems in the royal marriage and highlighted the tension between religious and military objectives that had plagued the entire expedition. Raymond's frustration with Louis's refusal to support the northern campaign contributed to growing divisions among the Crusader leadership and missed what might have been the last realistic opportunity to achieve meaningful military success during the Second Crusade. Conrad III, having recovered somewhat from his wounds and gathered a small force of surviving German nobles, arrived in Jerusalem in April 1148, followed shortly afterward by Louis VII and the remnants of the French expedition. The two monarchs were received with great ceremony by King Baldwin III of Jerusalem and the other leaders of the Crusader states, who desperately hoped that even these reduced forces might help address the growing Muslim threat. However, the reality of what remained from the once mighty crusading armies was sobering. Instead of the hundreds of thousands of warriors who had departed Europe with such fanfare, only a few thousand effective fighting men had reached the Holy Land. The Palestinian Crusader nobility, facing their own military pressures from Nur ad-Din's expanding power in northern Syria, had to reassess their strategic options based on these limited resources. Despite the disappointing numbers, the arrival of two European kings still carried significant prestige and offered the possibility of some military action that might salvage something from the catastrophic expedition. Plans began to be discussed for a campaign that would demonstrate continued Christian strength while working within the constraints of the available forces and the complex political situation in the region. In a council of war held at Acre in June 1148, the assembled Crusader leadership made one of the most controversial decisions in crusading history. Instead of attempting to recapture Edessa, the original objective of the Second Crusade, or focusing on the growing threat posed by Nur ad-Din in northern Syria, they decided to attack Damascus. This choice was strategically questionable, as Damascus had been relatively neutral in recent conflicts, and its ruler, Anur, had even occasionally allied with the Crusader states against their common enemies. The decision appears to have been influenced by the desire for a quick, prestigious victory that would restore European prestige and provide the economic benefits of capturing a wealthy city. Some historians suggest that the Templars and other military orders pushed for the Damascus campaign because of its potential financial rewards. Conrad III and Louis VII, eager to achieve some success after the disasters of their overland journey, supported the plan despite warnings from some local nobles who understood the regional political situation better. The choice of Damascus as a target would prove to be a strategic blunder that ultimately strengthened Muslim unity against the Crusader states and marked the final failure of the Second Crusade. In July 1148, the combined crusading army, numbering perhaps 50,000 men including local Crusader forces, marched out from Jerusalem toward Damascus with high hopes of finally achieving a meaningful victory. The initial phase of the campaign proceeded smoothly as the Christian forces advanced across the familiar terrain of southern Syria, maintaining good order and discipline despite the summer heat. When they reached the outskirts of Damascus, the city appeared vulnerable, with its defenders seemingly unprepared for such a large-scale assault. The famous gardens and orchards surrounding Damascus provided both cover for the attacking forces and a source of fresh food and water, leading many Crusaders to believe that victory was within their grasp. The site of the ancient city, one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth, and a major center of Islamic learning and culture, stirred the imagination of the European nobles who dreamed of adding such a prize to the Crusader territories. Local intelligence suggested that the city's defenses were not as strong as other major Muslim strongholds, and some optimistic commanders began planning the division of expected spoils. However, this apparent opportunity would soon reveal itself to be a carefully laid trap. The siege of Damascus quickly turned into a catastrophic failure that epitomized all the problems that had plagued the Second Crusade from its inception. Initially positioned in the fertile gardens west of the city, where they had access to water and supplies, the Crusaders inexplicably decided to move to the eastern side of Damascus, where the terrain was more barren and the defenses stronger. This tactical blunder has never been fully explained, though some sources suggest treachery or bribery influenced the decision. Meanwhile, Damascus's ruler Anur had sent urgent appeals for help to Nur ad-Din and other Muslim leaders, successfully portraying the Christian attack as a threat to all of Islam in the region. Muslim reinforcements began arriving from Aleppo and other cities, rapidly transforming the strategic situation from a siege to a potential encirclement of the crusading army. As enemy forces gathered in increasing numbers around their positions, and with supplies running low in the barren terrain they now occupied, the Crusader leadership realized that their situation had become untenable. After only 4 days of ineffective siege operations, the decision was made to withdraw. The retreat quickly became a rout as Muslim forces harassed the fleeing Christians, inflicting heavy casualties and completing the humiliation of what had begun as the largest crusading expedition since 1099. The failure at Damascus marked the inglorious end of the Second Crusade, leaving profound consequences that would reshape the medieval world for generations. Conrad, III, his reputation severely damaged and his treasury depleted, departed for Europe almost immediately after the retreat, never again to attempt such an ambitious eastern expedition. Louis VII lingered in the Holy Land through the winter, perhaps hoping to salvage something from the disaster, but eventually returned to France in 1149 with little to show for his enormous investment in blood and treasure. The Crusade's failure had far-reaching political ramifications, contributing to the eventual annulment of Louis and Elena's marriage, and thereby bringing Aquitaine under English control when Elena married Henry II. More significantly, the military disasters suffered by the European armies demonstrated to Muslim leaders that the Frankish states were not invincible, encouraging the rise of leaders like Nur ad-Din and eventually Saladin, who would ultimately recapture Jerusalem in 1187. The Second Crusade's failure marked the beginning of the end for the Crusader states and fundamentally altered the balance of power in the medieval Mediterranean world. The expedition that had begun with such hope and religious fervor became a cautionary tale about the dangers of poorly planned military adventures and the limits of religious enthusiasm in the face of strategic realities. If you liked today's story, make sure to check out our other videos on our channel. Have a nice day.